right, I think we are live. Well, welcome everybody to Private Equity CXO's latest webinar, The Evolving Role of Today's CFO. Thank you all for joining us as we explore how expectations for CFOs in PE-backed companies are changing and how today's leaders are rising to meet current challenges. Today, portfolio company CFOs are no longer seen exclusively as financial stewards. Sponsors are looking for finance leaders who can truly move the needle on value creation, combining strategic vision with rapid execution amid shifting market circumstances. Modern CFOs must also lead through influence, balancing the dynamic between sponsor and CEO while building high-performing teams. With market volatility, tighter financing environments, and growing pressure to harness data, analytics, and AI for decision making, the CFO's mandate has expanded far beyond the balance sheet. Today's leaders must unite data, strategy, and interpersonal leadership to guide their organizations through complexity while maintaining focus on growth and investor returns. Our panel today brings together three accomplished PE-backed CFOs who will share how they're adapting to this new reality, what's working, what's changing, and how today's finance leaders can continue to stand out in an increasingly competitive environment. This webinar is brought to you by Private Equity CXO, the world's largest digital community of private equity-backed executives with over 50,000 members. PE-CXO's mission is to help our community build better teams and drive returns in the private equity-backed middle market. I'm your host, Sahar Samand. I'm a senior search associate at Falcon. Falcon is a leading retained executive search firm with an exclusive focus on finding transformational C-suite talent for private equity-backed companies. Before we begin, I do want to let our audience know that this is an interactive session, so don't hesitate to submit your questions in the Q&A section as you have them. And a recording of this webinar will also be available on Private Equity CXO's website. With that said, I'm excited to introduce our panel of experts who will be sharing their insights and experience today. First, we have Tatiana Scholl, CFO of All Clear Underground Solutions. Tatiana leverages her deep operational finance expertise to guide growth, accelerate transformation, and deliver results while challenging the status quo and fostering inclusivity and continuous learning. She's worked across multiple industries from biotech to construction and has delivered sustainable organic and M&A growth in private, PE, and VC environments. Next, we have Jim Silvestri, CFO of Chronicle Heritage. With more than 25 years of leadership experience, Jim brings deep expertise in financial strategy, cash flow management, business planning, and negotiation to drive sustainable growth and operational excellence. He's guided high-growth manufacturing, distribution, and service organizations through complex financial landscapes and excels in acquisition integration, process optimization, and ERP implementation. Finally, we're joined by Alper Tukin, CFO of Hegarty Literacy Resources. He is passionate about helping companies scale with purpose, clarity, and data-driven decision-making. Throughout his career, he's guided growing organizations across the education and technology sectors through transformation, acquisitions, and rapid expansion. He turns complex data into clear stories that drive action and builds strong teams where everyone feels connected to the mission and inspired to perform at their best. Thank you so much for all of you being here today. We can go ahead and dive in here, firstly discussing becoming a PE-backed CFO. And Alper, if you could start us off, what do PE sponsors look for in their candidates, and how can you break into PE without prior PE-backed finance leadership experience?
Yeah, thank you, Sahar. Good question, probably a relevant one for a lot of people on the call today. But private equity, essentially, they want evidence that you've been through change. So like Sahar said, even if you're not, obviously the easiest way to get a PE-backed company CFO position is to be a PE-backed CFO. But if you're not, I think evidence that you've been through change. And so that can be, a number of things, right? Have you helped implement a new system? Have you helped integrate, a company or been part of the integration of an acquisition? Have you owned a budget, right? Have you collaborated kind of cross-departmentally in the budget or forecasting process? And so I think being able to demonstrate those with clear examples is going to be helpful. And so I just recommend, candidates like, as you're trying to break in, really think of yourself as an owner of your domain, where you work, because being a private equity backed CFO, it's not all about just reporting and the data and the analysis. It's okay, who's an owner of this business, right? Because they're going to be handing you, the keys to this big investment they just made. You are the largest, contributor of that financial feedback loop of the decision making, the ROI on that decision, and the command of the data and the systems. And so I think showing that you've been through change, showing that you've been an owner in your domain are going to be incredibly helpful as you're going through that recruiting process.
Yeah, absolutely. And Tatiana would love to hear your experience as well in this topic.
I think Alper hit the nail right on the head and highlighted the key things. The way that I think about it, it's for PE, it's not just being good with the numbers. It really is about driving transformation. And in order to drive transformation, you have to be able to evaluate the strategy. You have to be able to implement the tools, and very importantly, get the buy-in from all the key stakeholders. Now, that buy-in component is what gives you the ability to move fast. And in PE, speed and execution are everything. So that's really kind of the main differentiator in there. The other thing that I've experienced myself is that in a lot of cases with PE, you have to be comfortable with building things from scratch. You come in and a lot of infrastructure that you might have been used to in different, especially public companies, is not there. And so, or I should say, is not yet there because that becomes your job to drive it forward. So you got to be able to think creatively, roll up your sleeves, rally the team, and make it happen. And so showing that you've been able to do those kind of things, even in non-PE environment, I think becomes a really differentiating factor and help you stand out among other candidates. And then the other component in PE is obviously working not just within the company, but also with the sponsor. So in that respect, I'd say the best thing is don't think about it like you are taking or considering taking the job. You got to look at it as you're entering the partnership. And so in order for you to be a great partner, right, and work together, you got to understand what is the thesis, what is the investment thesis, what is their communication style, how hands-on are they, and really truthfully assess, does that work for you? Because you're going to be working very, very closely, not only with the leadership and the rest of your company, but also with the sponsors. And so that helps align early on and avoid the surprises later.
Absolutely. And Jim, I would love to hear a little bit about your experience as well, getting into private equity.
Sure. When I first started searching for a role in private equity, it seemed to me like the only way that having that prior PE experience was kind of critical. And you think to yourself, well, how do I get the job if I don't have the experience? How do I get the experience if I can't get a job? And then I started to realize that that really wasn't what it was about. Alper kind of talked about it a little bit too. It's really about being able to demonstrate uh, an ability to drive EBITDA growth. And being able to highlight that in your experience. Show where you've led transformations like an M&A integration or an ERP system implementation. And also kind of touching on what Tatiana said, there's the difference between PE and a private company or even a public company is you have to align yourself with the fund and the value creation plan, and and make sure that it aligns with what you're capable of, and B, what you want to do. um, some other things that you think about is in private equity, there's usually a significant amount of leverage. So your ability to generate cash flow and manage liquidity, having demonstrable evidence of managing that in your past is also helpful to get your foot in the door. Um, KPIs are big, not just measuring them, but being able to help drive achievement of those KPIs. And also, one of the things that I learned that really was probably the most important in getting my foot in the door was staying in your wheelhouse, right? Understanding what you're good at and understanding where the right environment is for you. If your experience is in growing companies from 50 to $100 million, don't go looking for a $250 million opportunity because you're probably not going to have the requisite experience to get that opportunity. So it's find the right opportunity for yourself, and they will come along.
Yeah, I agree, Jim. And yeah, the only other thing I would add, as Tatiana and Jim, you were talking was, don't be afraid to reach out to other CFOs on LinkedIn. Like we've all caught a break, somewhere, and I'm sure, a lot of you have caught a break too somewhere in your careers. But just talk to them and understand if you're applying into a certain industry, go reach out to a CFO in that industry, right? You might have to reach out to a few in order for one of them to get back to you because we're all very busy. But I would just recommend that. And then you can, you kind of understand, what are the layman's terms of what is discussed so that, if you're applying for a job and you're in an interview, you're sounding, a lot more knowledgeable and you kind of know, the little ins and outs of, that specific industry and then just, the CFO job in general.
Yeah, and I'd like to piggyback on that too, because I think one of the things that was very helpful to me as well, when you think back over the course of your career, I was controller for the same CFO for 8 years, who ended up becoming a private equity CFO, and has become a tremendous mentor and sounding board for me. So yeah, it's not how deep can you reach into your network, as well as maybe even some unknown people that you're that are industry specific.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would add one more piece. I think considering joining some of the professional associations is also helpful because it provides really a forum to exchange those ideas naturally. So, for example, I lead Tampa Bay chapter of IMA, and we have different, levels and different roles of people who join, but there are CFOs present as well, so you can bounce ideas and get a feel of what's going on in there.
No.
Well, that's some really great information and insight. We can switch gears a little bit here, getting into the topic of new expectations and demands for CFOs. Alper, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off again, what are some best practices for succeeding in today's environment? And how are economic conditions impacting the way CFOs manage financial leadership? And what solutions have you found to some of these problems?
Yeah. I think this has always been the case in private equity, but even more so now with the kind of current economic backdrop. But how do we do more with less, right? And so how are we getting more out of our OpEx, right? The spend that we're spending, how do we get more revenue out of that so that, like Jim touched on, we can grow EBITDA, faster than revenue because that's the general building blocks of the math, a private equity firm needs in order to, add real value, shareholder value to the company so that they can get the requisite return on their money. And so, the buzzword, but I would say, artificial intelligence or AI is a big theme in that. And so, while it's not the CFO's sole responsibility to implement, AI in the company, and it's not the CFO's sole responsibility to scale the business, right? You're going to have your cross-departmental leadership. You're going to have your COO or your CRO and your head of marketing and head of professional development, whatever those departments are. The CFO plays a key role in leading those conversations internally and with the board and communicating, hey, this is how we're thinking about driving this change. And so, it can be just general questions like, hey, how do we use AI, to do our customer order processing more efficiently, right? How do we use AI, on our communications team so that they can create more content out into the market, into your customers or into prospective customers, right? How can engineering use AI to accelerate product development? So I know right now we're at this like intersection of, AI is not just new, but it's not like fully developed where you have these companies that can fully implement it, maybe on the cusp of cool trick and implementation, ready at companies. But we're getting there. And I really think over the next few years, that's going to be a big theme in terms of how companies can get more efficient, can get more scalable. and thus, increase their, their EBITDA growth and their profitability.
Yeah, Jim, and I know that you work in professional services, so would love to hear a little bit about your perspective on this as well.
Yeah, when you think about the fact that we're a professional services company and we do a lot of work, we're an archaeological services company, so a lot of the work that we're doing is pre-construction, somewhat regulated, both at the federal and state level. And when you think about the current political climate or the current economic climate, when you're in the midst of a government shutdown or you're in the, earlier in the year where you had the DOGE cuts. It impacts the top of your funnel, right? So part of the job as a CFO is not to say, well, sales are down because the market's changing. Part of that role is identifying those risks early on, and helping the company pivot and find alternate solutions. So where we have found success is looking at other opportunities, where maybe federal regulations have slipped, but there are some states where there's more aggressive regulation that still requires the services. And we're one country out of out of a global population, so we've also started expanding overseas as a result, to create more opportunities to grow. Um, And when you talk about best practices, finance really needs to become a partner in that strategy, and helping the company adapt, finding alternative revenue streams, alternative markets, um, and then, like I had mentioned earlier too, one of the big things that comes along with that is liquidity, right? You've got debt service, and you need to be able to model how these top of the funnel impacts uh, how the top of the funnel is ultimately going to impact your cash flow. Um, and you got to be able to stress test your cash flows and figure out where, if revenue is going to drop 10%, what is that going to do to your cash flow for the next 3 months? And how quickly can you replace that revenue? Um, and then I think one of the other things that's critical, as critical skill set for the CFO, is being able to reach across, right? We're not One of the changes that exists now is we're not sitting in a funnel anymore, right? We've got to be able to reach across departments, and you've got to be able to work with your CRO, with the CHRO, with the CMO, with the, so, and be able to drive that financial accountability across all departments. So you can't just sit in your office anymore, and just focus on the numbers. Your ability to relate interpersonally is going to be critical to your success going forward. And to touch on AI a little bit, I think when we think about AI, obviously we're a service business, so people and time are part of our biggest part of our expenses. So when we think about how can we practically use AI, it's how do we drive more, right? Like Alper was saying, how do you drive more with less, or how do we get more out of the same level of people? And anything we can do to reduce the amount of time it takes to do something will increase our profitability.
Thanks, Jim. And Tatiana would love to hear a little bit about your perspective and experience with deploying AI and automation and your, your strategy here as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like overall overarching thing for me is for the evolving CFO role is that it is beyond the numbers person. I really think about it as a connector of connecting the strategy, systems, processes, and people so that we can make the vision into actual reality. And so strategy is also not enough because you actually got to execute and get to those results. So that becomes key overall in private equity environment, and especially when you consider the typical timeframes. So you've got to be able to move for those at a pretty good pace. On AI, I'd say AI these days is everywhere and it's developing very, very rapidly. And I think it's very important for CFOs to deploy it with purpose. Now, if you think back before AI was a thing, efficiency optimization has always been at the heart of finance, right? We always look how can we make things better, faster, and improve overall operations. So with AI, I think we're entering the new frontier because all of a sudden you have to learn this new development technology as you go, and you have to be able to be willing to experiment because you don't know what it is, and you have to create the environment for your teams to feel safe to experiment, right? So it has to be open to potentially making mistakes and making sure that we learn as we go. But I think the core thing of it is it frees up time, and I look at it as it frees up time for value creation. So the quicker we can get rid of some of the mundane things and let it handle it, then we can actually focus on, looking what do things actually mean? How does that affect how we move forward with the business? At All Clear, we're, automation and AI is front and center. We just went through and actually implemented fill time tracking. That was on the automation side, and that allows the real time time data to actually flow through and for us to do the faster analysis and see what's going on. We're also testing agentic AI right now for the AP. So instead of our AP team answering the phone, inquiries from the vendors of where the payment, etc., the AI actually handles it. It's hooked up right into our system and is able to provide the information. Again, allowing the team to then focus on more value-added activities. So that's kind of where I see it, and I think we're probably going to see a completely different business world here in a couple of years at the speed these things are developing. And then on uncertainty of things, I like to think about it as scenarios. Like you always got to have plan A, B, and preferably plan C as well, preferably in advance. And so when things don't happen as you expect, what is going to be next? And so to me, that's the approach for risk management, basically building in that flexibility into your plans and being prepared for multiple outcomes, because the minute something doesn't go, if you thought about it, you can pivot quickly and not lose a bit with your plans.
Yeah, Tatiana, on that last point, and you touched on this a little earlier on the data, but I always there's one thing to have data insights, but it's another thing to how do you turn that data insights into a narrative or a story, just like what you were talking about, Tatiana. And something I'm always trying to do is okay, this is what the data says. It's okay, so what? What does that mean, right? And what's the story? What's the narrative we're telling ourselves? And so like Jim mentioned, when you need a pivot where it's okay, this is the story we're telling. This is the trajectory of that story. But knowing your different scenarios for okay, but if the story goes this way, right? If it goes, whether your revenue is going down or it's going up, then so what? What are you doing as a result of that story? And I think that's important to, not just use data from an FP&A perspective, but blending that data into the storytelling and the scenarios, I think is really important. And I would agree with that, Tatiana.
Agree, and then linking it to the value creation, right, to your investment thesis, and then it becomes even more powerful. Yeah.
All right. Let's switch gears here again and discuss a little bit more about the nuances of PE-backed CFO leadership. What are some of the aspects that make PE-backed finance leadership unique, from the CFO's role in M&A to interpersonal aspects like working more effectively with sponsors? Tatiana, would love to hear your perspective on this one.
Yeah, I think on the continued theme here, I think in PE-backed environment, it's far beyond managing the numbers. It's actually more like building the engine that makes the investment thesis real. And so generally, right, people think growth is exciting, but in a PE environment, you have to really earn that growth. And how you do that is for cash discipline, for having the scalable systems through operational alignment. So all those things become front and center. And really, for me, I think of it as you're a translator and a builder. You're translating that vision into actually actionable plans. And then at the same time, you are building or leading the team to build the infrastructure, the processes, and the accountability in order to sustain the whole build and execution of that strategy. For All Clear, for example, we've gone through multiple acquisitions in a pretty short period of time. And so to keep up with the growth, it became very important to stand up some core systems like NetSuite. We've also launched Shepherd, which is the time tracking tool that we're using, has a lot more capability than time tracking, but that while also managing liquidity, while also managing earnout structures from those acquisitions, and all of that at the PE speed of things. So the discipline of knowing where you're going and keeping with that becomes very, very important. And then as far as I think the other key component is staying anchored to that investment thesis. That is your true North Star. And so, as with anything, sometimes questions arise, tensions arise. The way to kind of bring it back into focus is to anchor at that, because at the end of the day, everybody who's involved is going for that investment thesis, right? You got the sponsors, you got the leadership team, so that helps bring things into focus. And then, transparency and communication becomes very important. I think showing the assumptions and making sure that people are clear of what is behind your kind of thought process is also important. So it's not a black box. And in general, I think it helps to keep everybody rowing in the same direction. And we know what happens when people don't. You kind of stay in the same place. So you do want to row in the same direction. So the bottom line, I guess, I think, translator, builder, and a navigator for the CFO, because you're always thinking a few steps ahead. You're trying to anticipate what the obstacles could be and balancing that ambition with the realism and making sure that you do responsible growth and keeping organization moving towards those goals.
Absolutely. And Jim, I'd love to hear a little bit about your perspective on some of those nuances of CFO leadership in a PE-backed environment.
Sure. I think Tatiana alluded to this a couple of times, but I think the pace and intensity that you'll see in a private equity backed company are going to be a little different than you'll find elsewhere. One of the things, and again, one of the reasons why communication is so important too, is if you're early in your private equity career, having being accountable to multiple parties can be a little bit of a challenge at first. When you learn how to manage CEO expectations versus board expectations versus lender expectations versus investor expectations, there's a lot of people you have to make happy. Um, and there's significant value creation focus, right? There's not a lot of rest, right? I created value today. It doesn't mean I get to take a break tomorrow. I've got to create value again tomorrow. And I think, as I was starting to say before, and communication is really critical too, because when you're communicating, it needs to be frequent, it needs to be concise, it needs to be data backed. And if you're doing that consistently, you're going to build trust. And one of the quickest ways to erode trust is with surprises. So you need to make sure you're staying ahead of everything that's going on. And so yeah, I think those are the main things that I would talk about as the nuances.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jim, I would like double underline and bold the no surprises. Like, I always say this internally to my team is like, I don't want any surprises, right? If we're closing the books, if we're going through the month in terms of revenue, I don't want to find out that, we had $100,000 of sales that we forgot to account for, or there's this big expense. And so I couldn't agree more with that. But yeah, and building off of what you said, Jim, and Tatiana as well, I would just add that like the CFO often acts as that bridge between the ambition and the sales growth of the CEO and then the discipline of the private equity firm. And that's not to say that the CEOs aren't disciplined. I want to be clear on that. They are. but it's just a little bit of that balance of, maybe more of the aspirational goals versus like the fund's focus on EBITDA growth and accountability. And so that balance, I think, can vary, depending on the CEO style. You could have a very P&L finance-based CEO who is already like in all the financial details. You could also have a CEO who's more sales minded, right? As an example, and they might need the CFO to gently rein in, some of the spending and bringing that conversation back to the core KPIs and the core value creation plan. So I would just add that. And the other thing I would add, that's related but on a slightly different track, is that, when you are a CFO, you're in charge of not just, the fund finance and FP&A and value creation. You're also in charge of all the day-to-day, like the accounting, right? And how the systems are connected and how that's, being automated, like Tatiana talked about. And I would just say like a good controller who's going to be your number two at your company can like significantly alter your day-to-day as a CFO of a private equity backed company. And so I think just making sure your team is staffed appropriately is really going to enable you to get out of the weeds and focus on, what those real needle movers are across the business. And, my wife and I always joke, like in my career, she can always tell when I have a bad controller, because it seeps into my conversations in the evening. And she knows when I have a rock star controller. She's like, oh, you're not really talking about work much, or you're kind of talking about, more of the exciting things about your job. And so I would say investing in your own team is really going to enable you to invest in yourself and the rest of the company.
Yeah,
Yeah,
couldn't agree more. Sorry, Jim, go ahead.
that's what I was gonna say. To echo that, I think I saw recently that, if your answer is maybe, then your answer is no, right? When you're making a hiring decision. So yeah, you have to have the right team underneath you to be successful.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it sounds like we all three of us,
Same
maybe
thing,
all
Jim.
have good controllers right now.
Yep.
Yes, very much so. And just got a rock star director of FP&A too. So
Oh, awesome.
Nice. Nice. Well, now we can go ahead and open it up for some Q&A. If anyone in the audience does have any questions that they want to ask, now would be the time to go ahead and put those in, and we can ask our panelists.
actually we just got a few come through.
Oh, there they are. There they are. Okay, great. Okay, so first question, can you speak a bit about the process of navigating through an exit?
Happy to go first. Yeah, someone sent me like a podcast once. I think it was like the Private Equity Fundcast. Something I would recommend, anyone here to listen. I think it's some ex-private equity operators in Chicago. I used to work there, and that's how I heard about them. But essentially the theme of that was like, you shouldn't be thinking about an exit when you go through an exit. You should be thinking about an exit the second you become a CFO at your company. And so you really should be thinking about, how am I setting up the systems and the data and the reporting that if a buyer were to come in today, like I would have all that information ready. And so I think that's really important, because you really want to make sure the infrastructure is there, because you hear about this with like CRMs a lot, like bad data in is bad data out. And it's the same thing with your systems. Do you have your customer accounts the right way? Are you tracking revenue the right way? If you've got some sort of, ARR subscription revenue, is that tracking the right way, so that when you get to that exit, 3, 4, 5 years down the road, it's not like a project you're having to undergo to like get all of your deliverables together. And so I would say that's the biggest thing, at least in my opinion, for an exit, is just get prepared early and really think about that exit in mind, and, be aligned with your private equity sponsor as you're making those decisions, right? Because, they'll probably help dictate that anyways, right? They're not going to let you run fully on your own, but just make sure, the two of you are on the same page, so that when that time comes, 3 years from now, when you're lucky enough to be acquired, it's just, kind of more day to day, like, okay, I'm putting these reports together.
And I would piggyback on that to say that since from day one you're creating the value and focusing on that, all of that becomes an integral part. And so you want to make sure that your, whatever it is, KPIs, the data structure, or whatever is going to indicate to you that you're on the right track, are in place, is also going to help at the time that of the exit. So you definitely want to have all of that as part of running the business, and then the exit will become much easier and more organized.
Yeah, and I think you also want to, be aware of the fact that you're going to probably most likely go through a buy side Q of E. And you want to, so you really need to be thinking about your transaction 2, 3 years in advance to make sure your normalizations, your EBITDA add backs adjustments are all defensible. Your books are clean. They should be clean anyway, but when you're getting yourself ready for sale, you've got to be ready to. If you're looking to get a 10 to 12 multiple, you've got to be able to defend your EBITDA. And they're going to use that Q of E to do everything they can to get the purchase price down.
Yeah. And I remember the first time I had a company acquired, they had like this long checklist. And I've actually just kept that. And I kept it from the second company that got acquired. And every time I start a new role, it's just looking at those and being like, okay, let me get into like that sale process mindset and then, invigorate that into how I'm starting off at this new company. Doesn't always stick, but enough of it sticks. Yeah.
Another great question here is, what's the one piece of advice you would give yourself that you wish you knew before you took on the role of a CFO of a PE-backed business?
I'll go first. I think one of the things when you're making that transition, it can sometimes be a little intimidating. And I think the first thing that I would remind myself of is I've earned this seat at the table. I belong at the table, and approach it with the confidence of somebody who's been doing this for 25 years.
Yeah, I would say like understand the business enough to understand what actually moves the needle at the company. And I think the sooner you can do that, because like I feel like at any given company, there's like three real needle movers, and then there's like a larger set of like kind of needle movers, but understand what moves the needle, focus on the KPIs around what moves the needle and the leading indicators, and be focused on that and be, to what Jim said earlier, like no surprises, right? Like track that data, understand that data, and understand when you need to alter either the movement of that needle or you realize, hey, that needle mover doesn't move the needle anymore, right? In today's market, and we need a new needle mover. I don't think I've ever said the word needle mover so many times, so I will stop right there, but that's what I would say.
And not really I guess the advice, but I think it starts at the initial selection, making sure that it's the right fit. Because if I think about success, I think the key things there is having the knowledge, right? So you have to have fundamental understanding of A, finance and accounting, B, of the business, how it runs. You might need to learn the new business, right? And then figure out what are the needle movers to back you up there, Alfred.
Yeah, thank you.
And but the success comes from the combination of that foundational knowledge and also the passion that you're going to bring in. So you got to be excited about this business because it's fast paced. It's a lot of work. If you're not excited, it's a difficult going. And so that initial stage, I think, is very important.
Yeah.
And a bit more technical question here. Though KPIs can certainly vary by company, what tend to be the forward indicating KPIs in companies that you've been involved in and should be tracking?
It's going to be very dependent on the business and the industry. But if you're in a business, like if you're in a B2B business, right, and you have sales reps who are adding pipeline and they need to eventually close that pipeline at a certain win rate, right? You just kind of work backwards from, okay, so like new pipeline added is a leading indicator, but like what's an indicator before new pipeline added, right? It's how many meetings are being booked by your team, right? And then you work backwards. Okay, well, what leads to the meetings being booked? Okay, how many calls and emails are being sent out? And so I think you just kind of work backwards there. It's just like an example of how I would do it is like, what's your end goal? It's like closed one pipeline. What do you need for closed one? You need pipeline. What do you need before pipeline? You need meetings, you need calls. And so I would just recommend going through an exercise like that and really working with, okay, like I'm not going to come up with that like in my basement on my own. I'm going to go talk to our CRO about that too and make sure we're fully aligned so that we're both tracking, the leading indicators and we have the buy-in because, she's the one who's in there day to day, like thinking about it 24/7. I might only be thinking about the KPI, maybe once a day, maybe once a week, but you want to make sure you have the buy-in from, the actual owner of that KPI as well.
Then to piggyback on that too, like if you just think about it from a very high level, like a swim lane or value stream map, what does the order to cash process look like, and then kind of understand to take it a little further than now you've got pipeline creation, you've booked your sale. How over what period of time are you going to recognize that revenue? At what profit margin? How long is it going to take you to convert that to cash? Um, you know, and things like that. Because again, profitability, liquidity, um, it all starts with the top of the funnel, but ultimately you've got to do the work and get paid, and you got to do the work profitably.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you can think about it on a more macro level as well. If your multiple is based on EBITDA, right, what is that ultimate EBITDA and what is the margin and how do you get there to kind of piggyback there? I think making sure that you do align with your business partners on what it is and setting the goals so that then you can drive it and see, okay, what do we think are the needle movers and are we actually on the right track? Because if we're not getting there, maybe something is off and maybe we need to take a different approach.
Great points. And another question we have here is, how do you ensure collaboration between finance and the other departments in your companies?
To me, finance has to position itself as a partner. There's really no other way. Maybe a long time ago it was finance in the corner doing the reports. It's no longer that. It is a partner in driving that value and making sure that the business grows. So, and how do you do that? How do you become a partner? I think it comes down to building trust and making sure that it is. And then you're going to ask the next question, how do you build trust? Right. And I think it comes down to making sure that, when you're talking to your business partners, you know your stuff. And when you promise them something that you deliver, and that's something that I preach to my team, right? When you commit, you deliver. And, after you do that a few times and have great conversations, you are going to see the results there on the trust. I think it's also that trust builds the environment where you can have healthy discussions. You don't want to be getting into, situation where people are afraid to share or, they think, what answer you're looking for and give you that. You want to have healthy discussions and you want to be able to have healthy conflict and push back on certain things and, settle on what it is to get there.
And I think when you're new in a role, the first thing you want to do is listen, right? And then that's part of the way you get that trust. If you can listen, understand what their needs are, maybe where your predecessor didn't build that partnership or gain that trust, um, and then get a couple of small wins, right? And you come out of the gate with a couple of small wins and start to build that trust, and it'll evolve over time. But if you come in with the assumption that you know everything, and you're going to tell them what to do, it's not always going to work. You want to be a good partner.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I would just say like a quick real world example is like if you're coming into like the seed, you're going to work with your marketing team. You want to understand the lead data. Listen to like Jim said, listen to the process of how, hey, like walk me through how these leads come in, right? And then when you ask for the data, like Tatiana said, like analyze it as a partner. Don't ask all these pointed questions right away. Just hey, help me understand this. Okay, Then you set your accountability targets with that department head so you're both on the same page for what they're being held accountable for. And then you can, then you can drive that accountability because that's the CFO's job to drive accountability across the business. So it's, hey, like I listened, I analyzed the data, we came up with this measure together. And now when I hold you accountable for it, we still have trust. I'm not pointing fingers at you, but it's something that now we're working together as partners, like Tatiana said. You don't want to come in hot, and just kind of like question, and because then you're never gonna build that trust, or you might, but it might be forced trust.
Great. Yeah, those are great answers. And another great question here is, how do you manage the visionary CEO who has many ideas and keep him in the business aligned with the investment thesis, but not stifle the benefits of the CEO?
I I think it's naturally going to come from not just the CFO, but also the board. So I think as you're having like whether they're weekly, biweekly, or monthly touch points, like, you're going to come back and center, like Tatiana said a few answers ago, on like the value creation plan. And so I think as long as you have like a North Star to your business, and maybe that North Star simply is just an EBITDA number. I think as long as you're using data to bring it back to your story, to the CEO, that's going to be the easiest. So it's not a, hey, this is what I think, this is what you think. It's just grounding it in the data, grounding it in hopefully the data that is revolving around some sort of North Star that you're discussing, not just between you and your CEO, but also with your board.
And I think one of the other things you have to consider, right, when you're looking at these, somebody's got a, that, ooh, something shiny and new, kind of a mentality. Try to tie it back to what are the key drivers, right? And if you understand what the key business drivers are, how does this new idea help accelerate growth? How does it help accelerate EBITDA? Um, and and also think about what's the likelihood of success? What's the risk? How much of a distraction is it going to be? And if you can explain those things and say, hey, yeah, this is a great idea, but it's completely tangential to what we're working on right now, or we've got these 7 other things that are more clearly tied to our business drivers. Where should we be focusing our energy on something, that could be the next Bitcoin, or it could be, or it could be the next, IBM, right? Something that's going to be steady. So that would be how I would approach it.
I would add that establishing your relationship with CEO is going to be key as well, to be able to have this kind of conversation so it doesn't come out weird, awkward, or whatever. It is key because really the CEO and CFO are partners in driving that value. And so you should be having discussions and kicking ideas around. And so that should come naturally as part of that process.
And
That
I
might be the
think,
most important thing said on the call today, that relationship with the CEO. I agree fully, Tatiana.
and I think one of the other things that I think a successful CEO does is find ways to get to yes, right? I think historically CFOs were thought of as people that were going to say no. And now to be effective partners, we have to help find a way to yes.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
Great insights there. And another question here that definitely ties into our entire discussion from today is, beyond the traditional finance and accounting function, it seems that the roles, responsibilities are rapidly increasing. What are the most important skill sets one needs for this role in the future?
I think business acumen and communication are right there at the top. Being to actually able to understand what drives a business and being able to communicate clearly are absolutely key.
Yeah, EQ has become just as important as IQ in the success of a CFO. Um, and I was going to say something else, and the thought just escaped me.
I would just add, in today's day and age, with like we've talked about AI, you've got this explosion of software companies being nimble and being quick to learn new systems. So hey, like Tableau to do your financial analysis. Yeah, I mean that's what I primarily use. But there might be an FP&A tool, there might be an AP tool, but using the tools to your advantage. And so being open-minded to learning these new tools can really, I think, just like unlock your efficiency. And there's a lot more you can do in a shorter amount of time, and you can then be more effective, to your business is what I would add. But I agree with the EQ as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that Alper touched on before, um, especially in the CFO is now becoming more strategic, and you're having a good controller that can handle the basic blocking and tackling of the accounting, where I think in years past you had to have a strong accounting background to make it to the CFO
Mhm.
seat. I think now you're seeing just as many FP&A directors make the leap into CFO roles today,
Yeah.
and probably a lot more in the future as well.
I will echo that adaptability is key. And I think the mindset of helping remove the obstacles and solve problems for your team and for overall business are extremely important.
Another question here. How have you dealt with varying levels of operational understanding from private equity stakeholders?
Can you say it one more time?
I was trying to understand the question too,
Yeah,
to
yeah.
be fully transparent.
Yeah, absolutely. So, it looks like the question is, how have you dealt with varying levels of operational understanding from
Oh,
private equity stakeholders?
yeah. I would just say, like, yeah, like different stakeholders are gonna know your business at a different level, right? So you might have a lower level person on the private equity, or on the investor side or the board, sorry, that really is kind of getting into the details. And you might send them a detailed model or file with all your customers in it, and you're kind of jamming through it a little bit together. Hey, I'm kind of working on this. Can you help me with this? Or but then you might have some that are really just thinking of like the North Star value creation plan, and they don't understand like the day to day. And I think it's just being adaptable to who you're talking to. And so you know your business well, and you'll know your board well. And so you just need to know when to go deep, and when not to get mired in the details, because there's nothing worse than being at a board meeting and someone's just talking about like all these details behind things, and it's like, hey, like this guy or girl who's at the top of the private equity food chain here like does not care about that. Like that's not what they were asking. They were asking about the general market trends or how we're shifting strategically. They don't care about what we're doing with our e-commerce website, right? And so I think it's just understanding that, like where people sit in that food chain at the board level, and at the private equity firm is going to be helpful, because you're just going to be more impactful, when you're meeting with them.
Yeah, and I would echo that a little bit, and maybe do a slight different take on it. So, it's you have to understand your audience, right? Because there are going
Mm,
to be some people that are going to want to get in the weeds. There are going to be some people that are capable of getting in the weeds, and then there are going to be some people that just want a three-word answer.
mhm,
So part of being successful in this situation is knowing who you're speaking to, knowing how they like to be communicated to, and their capacity. Um, how do I think part of being a CFO is being able to take large amounts of data, complex scenarios, and distill it down to simple uh, sound bites.
mhm.
Yeah, I would second that. Pulling out of the weeds and presenting at the high level, and then if there's appetite or interest or whatever that might be to dive into more details, being prepared to do so. But I think it comes down to explaining some of what might be technical items in actually everyday language that is understandable by people who might not be as close to the business as you are.
Absolutely. And looks like we have time for maybe one more question here. And could each of you just discuss some of the biggest lessons that you've learned in this role?
I guess I'll go first. And I think one of the things is there's a saying, bad news doesn't get better with time. So that kind of ties back to the no surprises, right? You want to make sure that you're out in front of anything, good news, bad news. You want to make sure you're communicating effectively and timely. If something, if there is a surprise, the worst thing to do is to keep it to yourself.
I'd say prioritization, having the right team in place, and getting to the point that you have right tools in place as well, because it's real difficult to make a beautiful statue with a hammer. So having those three components, I think, sets you up for success, and those are probably the key learnings that I've come across.
Yeah, both of your points are going to be better than mine, but since I'm third, I'll just say, and I think this applies outside of just CFO work, but just kind of taking the 80-20 rule to heart. Like, what can you spend 20% of the time to get 80% of the way there on? Not over perfecting things. Like, obviously you want to make sure your numbers are perfect and your numbers aren't changing ever historically, and you want to have a tight close process. You want to make sure your KPIs are correct, but just kind of not like overthinking kind of how to do things and perfecting it where you've now spent 15 hours on something that, hey, you probably could have gotten 80% of the way there spending 2 hours, and then you could have focused across other areas of the business. Because at the end of the day, you're not building decks that are for some 10,000 person company where you're presenting at some quarterly board meeting like that where they're going to be public. But I would just say that 80-20 rule has been just helped me just not get stuck too far into the weeds and to focus on what actually matters. Sometimes you have to go the full 100%, don't get me wrong, but for most things I don't think you need to get mired in every little detail.
Yeah, some great points. Well, we are reaching the end of our time here. So I wanted to say thank you to Alper, Tatiana, and Jim for your participation and the insights you shared. Also, a huge thanks to our audience for your attendance and the questions you asked. As a reminder, this webinar will be available on privateequitycxo.com to view anytime. This has been a great conversation. And thank you, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sahar.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye.